Hey everybody, it's Pastor Tom again on the 24 Today podcast. Thanks again for listening in. I am so excited to have Ben Pierce with me today because Ben has a real heart for Jesus, and he is one of those people that doesn't just talk about knowing Christ and talk about wanting people to know Christ, but he's actually out there doing it. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
Good
you.
to be here.
Thank you, sir.
I say here, but that's, digitally I'm here.
You are here. You are in Minnesota, or
Correct.
do they say Minnesota? Is that, how do I say that?
Some do, but I'm not necessarily native, so I keep it more neutral.
Okay.
Just standard Minnesota.
Just Minnesota, just like the rest of us.
Exactly.
Ben, you are the lead singer and guitarist for an internationally known rock band, which is called No Longer Music. And again, if you're just listening in, not sure who No Longer Music is, just Google it, nolongermusic.com, and you can find out more about them. Your band is incredible for different reasons, but one of those reasons is because who you are reaching. You have a real passion not to just do the regular Christian concert venues and reach Christian people, which that's fine for what that is. But in a lot of ways, those concerts end up being just kind of like a church service with a different format or different way of doing it.
Right.
Your passion, though, is that your band is going to festivals. Your band is just going in lots of areas that aren't regular church concert venues, and you're reaching people that would never set foot in a church. And I love that about what you're doing.
Yeah, that's our heart. I mean, it's been around for almost 40 years now, which is hard to believe. So I obviously did not start it. That would have been a bit intense. I would have gone back in time or something. But
right.
No, I've been involved for 12 years. It started back in the 80s in Amsterdam. The whole heart was there was a movement, a social movement at the time, which were the punks and the anarchists.
Okay.
And they were this angry, rebellious group of people.
Yes.
And as you said, they're not coming to a church for answers.
Right.
And so my dad actually started the band as a way to go to their places, to their venues and festivals, and to lift up Jesus in a way that they could understand. And God has put his hand on this from the very beginning. And so now I've been involved for 12 years, 12 consecutive summers. I've been on the road, and we also tour at various other times. We're about to go to Colombia actually in December. And now primarily how it looks is we'll set up in city squares all over Europe, Middle East, Brazil. We are in New Zealand, like I said, Colombia coming up. So it's not even just the fringe extreme places. We are going where normal people are. And when you say people that aren't going to come to a church, that's a growing demographic.
Yes,
in fact,
it is.
That's becoming the demographic.
Yes. Even in the United States,
Yeah, exactly. And so quite simply, we're just trying to be like Jesus and go to places where normal people are.
Yes.
And to lift up Jesus to them in a way that they can really get it.
And your concerts are drawing large numbers of people. I mean, in the thousands, right? I mean, you have, which is amazing. You're like 4,000, 5,000, 6,000. Am I right on that?
That'd be a little bit on the high end, though we do get that. It varies. I mean, we anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. I mean, we're not known in a conventional sense. The countries we'll go to, we're not necessarily, famous in that way, and so we'll often pair ourselves with a famous local band.
Okay.
When we were in Brazil, we toured with one of the bigger secular bands there, and so we played in packed places everywhere we went. But our show is also highly, highly visual and entertaining.
Yes.
I mean, we use video and dance and fire and special effects, and we call it street performance on steroids, because that's kind of the method. We go to a very populated place. We'll play this highly visual, highly entertaining show, draw a big crowd, and then we begin to transition into the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and very modern, very contextualized to a modern audience. but also very clear and uncompromised.
Yes.
And then we verbally proclaim who Jesus is and give people a chance to respond. And yeah, God has just done incredible things all over the world.
And you are singing in areas that know very little about Christ or have very little opportunity to hear about the message of Jesus, or what they've heard is really weird and bad and off base, or maybe even in some areas it's not even legal per se to be preaching or talking about Christ. So you're getting into those countries and those parts of the world.
Yeah. I mean, we've that's always kind of been the calling card of No Longer Music, is to be in sort of extreme places. So they were in Soviet Union before the wall came down. They were in Vietnam. They were in some of the terrorist clubs in Spain in the Basque area. So they have this history of really going places no one else would go to. In more recent years, that's been Muslim countries. We've been in northern Iraq, in Lebanon, in Albania, in Turkey. Places where, there's varying degrees of difficulty. It's not necessarily illegal, but it's certainly not received warmly as well. So it's a little bit of this, the government says, yeah, come with one hand, and then they do everything on the other hand to oppose you. So we've had our power cut, we've had our permissions canceled, we've had stones thrown at us, we've had riots break out. But you look at the book of Acts. I mean, I think in the church we want to experience God's blessing and His favor. We kind of want to minimize that stuff about beatings and riots and the opposition that the gospel might come with presenting the gospel. And to me, you don't get His miracles without His riots. So,
right. I think one of your recent podcasts, maybe it was a couple of podcasts ago, you were just talking about how we are comfortable and we don't want to go out of our comfort zone, and that's a big part of our problem in as Christians today. But you are actually living totally outside of a comfort zone, because you probably have no idea what to expect when you start playing and you're in those environments.
I think that there's confrontation in the gospel, and so I think inherent in that is a risk, because you're evoking something, you're challenging a spirit, a rebellious spirit in people, and so certainly we've been in places where we performed one time in a city in Turkey of 300,000 people, no known church, and when we showed up there was a big banner hanging across the stage, and our local promoter looked very concerned. And we were like, what's wrong? And he said, well, it says in Turkish, welcome to the Ramadan festival. And it turns out you guys are the opening act of the Ramadan festival in this city.
Oh my goodness.
I'm not sure how that happened. I mean, this is a Muslim holy month. This is a strongly Muslim area. And they invite this even Western in the minds of Islam, Muslim means Christian, let alone an evangelistic, gospel-preaching band from the West to open their Muslim holy month. So, we didn't know what was going to happen when we proclaimed the name of Jesus on local television to open the Muslim Holy Month in Manavgat, Turkey. So there is always a risk there. But again, I think if you open up your mouth with, and share with your neighbors, if you're willing to share with your coworkers, you're confronting something that's going to evoke a reaction.
You are. I mean, the Bible does talk about the cross being offensive, but there's also something offensive just in the fact of us saying you need a savior.
Of course.
Because people say, no, I don't. I mean, I'm doing pretty well.
Right.
Oh, and when we say you need a savior, we are in effect saying that you're doing life wrong, and if you keep doing things the way you're doing, I mean, it's not going to have a good ending, a good result. So, but I mean, we don't say it that way, but that's kind of, I think, part of the offensive nature of just the message of needing a savior.
Right. Yeah. No, for sure. You're challenging the spirit of our age, which is, at least in the West, is secular humanism, and that says that I am God.
Yeah.
I determine the best course for my life. There are things, the fact value divide. There are things that we can test that are objective, and those are, scientific things. But then there's values, and that's for me to determine. So for you to tell me that I am doing something wrong in that realm is to violate one of the most strongly held mindsets of our day, which is we're all gods. We killed the God, but in doing so, we made a million more. And so you don't challenge that. That's inviolable in our culture.
Now, do you see a hunger in the people that you're ministering to in all these different countries? Do you see a genuine hunger there for God?
I think that there are certainly people who are living life, they're happy, and they don't want what you have, right? There's going to be people at the end of shows where I'm like, what'd you think of the message? And they're like, don't care. So you have, of course, a subset of that, but I do think that for a lot of people, they're beginning to discover the logical outworkings of a secular worldview that is very bankrupt. And so they're realizing that though they are able to do everything, though nothing is off limits, that they're seeing the destruction that it's having in their lives and the lives of their friends. They love to be online and on social media, but they're also reaping the benefits of being completely isolated and community having been eroded, where relationships are so hard to come by. So there's an intense loneliness. I think at a very young age now, you're finding people who are they're realizing very early on that the things of life aren't going to satisfy these longings that they have, that there's something missing. And so I think there is a hunger for something. If you just say Jesus on the outset, I think that they might reject that based on false perceptions of who he is. But there is a hunger for the real Jesus. There is a hunger for the non sort of we've added so much baggage to what it means to follow God. There's been so much, things, political things and religious things, and so they just think, Jesus, what? No, but there is a hunger. So what I've discovered is when they discover who Jesus is, let me tell you it this way. The number one thing I hear is, that is so great what you do there or in Brazil or Spain, but that's cute, but that wouldn't work here. And I think it's based on this idea that people aren't really that open, and I haven't discovered that to be true. I think when you present who Jesus is and he moves through that in power, we see people giving their lives to him every place we go.
Yeah, it's God's Spirit moving. I mean, if it was up to us to do anything, for God, we'd all fall so short. I look at like greats like Billy Graham, and I guess I could say the same things that Billy Graham said, and I could end the service with "just as I am," as he did, or whatever, and not necessarily have the same response. But the thing about Billy Graham is that they set that up with so much prayer. I mean, there was so much prayer before he even went to an event to do something, and so that was all. It was really all God, and so it really is. If you're just tuning in, you missed the first part. I am Pastor Tom, and you can find out more about me at 24today.org or also tomwhitesel.com. But my special guest is Ben Pierce, and he is part of an international rock band that is called No Longer Music. You can find him at nolongermusic.com, and he has a book that's just come out today. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, anytime somebody writes a book, I think it's cool. I mean, that's an amazing thing. And so your book is called Jesus in a Secular World. And just released today. You can find it on Amazon, and you can also find it through nolongermusic.com. Any other areas?
Steiger.
Oh, that's Steiger. Okay. Yeah. Can you spell that for us?
Well, actually, Steiger is STEIGER.org, but JesusInTheSecularWorld.com, it's a trick because it just reroutes you to Steiger.
Gotcha. Okay.
But that's kind of the easy URL to remember, just like the title of the book, JesusInTheSecularWorld.com.
Good. Okay. And I am anxious to read that. let me just read you or mention a quote from that book as we get back into our discussion. And here it is. I'm quoting you, and it says, "The church is irrelevant to my day-to-day life. It's just a dead, empty tradition of the past. This is the overwhelming consensus among young people today, and it has resulted in an ever-widening cultural divide between the secular youth culture and the church. Much of what was formerly regarded as the Christian world is leaving its roots behind and is dominated by secularism and relativism. The Bible is no longer considered the moral compass, but rather everyone is free to decide for themselves what is right and wrong." Would you comment, Ben, on your thoughts on that?
Yeah. The book, I'm really personally inspired by the life of Nehemiah in the Bible, and I think that the book ends up following his response, his kind of the pattern he lays out for responding to a need. And so, what is Nehemiah? How does it begin? He's doing great, right? But then he's confronted with a need. He's actually made aware of the reality of the world around him, and I think that sums up a lot of us. Is that many of us live in pretty good isolation. We don't. We go to our church and we have our church friends and we have our private schools and we live in our communities and we don't necessarily recognize the state of the world around us. And this statement is intended to reflect the dire reality of the global youth, which is that they don't see the world the way we do. And I think a lot of what we do to try to reach them, I think betrays the fact that we don't understand them.
Yes.
Because we're, like you said, I don't know if it was when we were recording or not, but you said so much of what we try to do is export the church service outdoors. And we think, wow, isn't that great? That's ministry. Let's invite all the great Christian acts together and have a rally. And, you even alluded to Billy Graham, this incredible man of God, and they did a lot of that. It was almost essentially outdoor church services, but that was in a time when you could go on the streets and pretty confidently assume that most people had Christian theism as their framework.
Right.
Now, they weren't all following that, of course, but that was the framework. So they weren't, they were, maybe more sympathetic or nominal to the things of God. So you could invite them to your church or to your church event, and they could be reached there. The reality is the global youth culture, they see God as a negative thing. They're actually hostile, many of them, to the things of God. And so we can't expect to reach them in that way. And so the whole heart of the book is know the need, begin in prayer, right? Because what does Nehemiah do? He lets God break his heart. He spends months fasting and praying, like you already said. Right. If we don't have God, this isn't about a cool method. Right. This isn't about growing your hair out and starting a rock band. This is about saying, God, if you don't move, I got nothing. Sure. It's like we read about the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and we think the whole point of the story is the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Let's maximize our resources, and let's figure out how to best divide the 5 loaves and be good stewards of the 5 loaves, and as if that's the point. Right? The point of the story is you and I got nothing. Right. We do not have enough. And if God does not multiply the little I have, what am I against the problems of the world? I'm nothing. And so the whole point of the book is know the need, break your heart, let God break your heart, respond in desperate prayer, learn the language of the people. Yes. Right? Get out of our bubbles. Yes. Be like Jesus. Learn the actual language. Stop answering questions people aren't asking. Yes. Stop assuming we believe what they believe. Actually get to know them, right? And then take a risk. It's all about courage. Because what does Nehemiah have to do in the end? He's got to say, all right, all this was great. Now I got to go risk everything I have to ask the king for permission and resources to go accomplish what I've been called to do. So that's kind of the pattern of the book, and that was a much longer answer than the question you asked. But. Good stuff.
Learn the language. That is so important. I remember a young man that I had met, and I think he was trying to shock me by asking me to listen to what he was currently listening to in his earbuds at the time, and so he said, "Just listen to this." And I said, "Great, could you give me the name of the band? And I just want to check it out." So he gave me the name of the band. I YouTubed it, and I listened like to the entire album that he was listening to, and I took notes because I listened to the songs, and so I just took some talking points. Also, I studied up about the band, and just so I learned kind of the names of the band members and kind of some of their backstory. And then I went back to him and I said, "Man, I was listening to that song more, and it's talking about this. What do you think about that?" Or that very interesting thought that it brings up in this song. What, can you tell me, what do you think about it? And so we started having this conversation over weeks about the music that he listened to, and then I would say, "Did you know this band member, had this going on in his life, and maybe he wrote that song because of what he was going through." And anyway, so I thought that went nowhere, basically. Although at least it gave us a way to start a friendship and we could talk.
Right.
But years later, I get this thing where I've since moved, but he found one of my websites and was commenting on something I wrote about God and asking me more about how to pray. And so the conversation continues, but it started over me trying to learn his language. Right. So that was a longer question than so there.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because it's not a revolutionary concept, right? It's just being like Jesus.
Right.
It's so funny because we look at the life of Jesus and how he communicated, and he spoke of fishing and farming and sheep and all these things, and we think, wow, that's cute. He used all these sort of agrarian terminology, and we then export that. I go to Minneapolis and I say Jesus is the good shepherd. Like, is that a powerful way to communicate who Jesus is today?
Right,
Obviously not. There's not a lot of sheep running around Minneapolis, and so we don't recognize that what's happening there is Jesus is simply speaking out of an intimate understanding of the people that he was with. And I think we have failed to understand that, and so we are trying to devise strategies rather than just to get to know people, because when you get to know people, then you don't have to wonder what they're thinking about or what's on their hearts. You can simply respond to the real life interactions you're having with them, and begin to communicate Jesus to them in a way that actually resonates with what's going on in their lives.
And it's easier not to love people when we don't know them. When we don't, it's easier to judge them. It's easier to just take this general position against them. But man, when you start to get to know people, even people who by nature or even scripturally, they are so against everything that you believe in. But when you get to know them, man, you start to root for them and you start to want, I don't know, I think it's the passion that you've got in your heart that I don't see. Unfortunately, a lot of Christians don't have the passion that you have for people knowing Christ. And it's so easy just to sit within the church walls and judge people and talk about how bad people are. And I think a lot of it's just because we don't know them. We don't hear their stories. And
I would maybe take it a step further and say that there's many people in the church that need to be saved. I think that for many people it's a political alliance, or it's a social club, or it's the socially acceptable thing to do, although that I would argue that's decreasing now. There's a higher and higher cost to associating yourself as a Christian. But I think part of it is we need a revelation. I mean, if you look at Isaiah 6, he doesn't, what happens first? He is made aware of the holiness of God. He has a revelation of God's holiness, which leads to an accurate understanding of his own need for God. And then in that process, he then says, "Here am I, send me." And I think part of the problem is you can't give what you don't have. You're not gonna be concerned for the lost if your relationship with God is academic or cultural. And again, I'm not trying to make a salvific claim here or call people out in that sense, but I do think that it starts with a personal revelation. It's an extension of a friendship. It's not a religious duty or an obligation. We are so in love with God and what he has done for us, and we are so passionate about getting to know him that then begins to overflow in us. I so know who God is. Of course, I'm going to take on a burden for the people that he cares about. How can I remain insular and self-absorbed when I start to get to know the heart of God, and I have a revelation of what it meant to save me? I think, of course, I'm gonna start doing what I can, and it's imperfect, and I need God's grace and mercy along the way. But I think it begins not as sort of an outward in thing, like, okay, all right, I feel bad, I'm listening to this podcast, I'll come up with a list of to-dos. It's first thing is just get to know God.
Right.
Really let him in, and I think he then begins to give you steps in terms of doing things outwardly.
A reminder, I'm Pastor Tom, and this is the 24 Today podcast, and you can check me out at 24today.org or tomwhitesel.com. My special guest has been Pierce, who is part of a band, and it's called NoLongerMusic.com. It's a great band with a wonderful ministry. They actually are not paid people. They, in terms of this band, they get raise their own money or get sponsored, and then they I think infrequently charge for their concerts, or maybe never. Yeah. So anyway, it's NoLongerMusic.com, and he has a book that's just come out today. You can find it on Amazon. Or through a website by that name, Jesus in a Secular World. Is it .com?
.com.
JesusInASecularWorld.com. So please check that out. Can you tell us a little bit about your podcast? I'm a listener, subscribe to it.
Awesome. Yeah. Like with so many things, I don't even really remember why or how we started it. I think probably just to fulfill a secret fantasy to be in radio. I live a sort of an alternate life to what I do. I mean, the heart of it began, we have a subset of our mission called Come and Live, and that is a ministry intended to train and release more artists with an evangelistic mission. And my dad and I and my brother, we wrote a book called Revolutionary, 10 Principles that will empower Christian artists to change the world. And it's a very basic manual kind of book, very simple, like, we wanted it to be accessible for anyone, any artist who could quickly pick it up. And but it's our heart. What have we learned, and how can you be effective? And so then we had this idea, well, why don't we take those 10 principles and kind of tease it out into a podcast? And then, like every podcast dilemma, how do you keep the thing going once you run out of the original idea? So it gradually developed into it's just a conversation about how can we follow Jesus in culture today? How can we deal with the various current events and different things that are happening? And it always attempts to answer the question, how would Jesus have us live? So it features myself and my dad, David Pierce, which of course is a unique dynamic, not too many father-son rock and roll ministry combos out there. And then Chad Johnson, who used to be an artist and development guy, an A&R guy for Tooth and Nail Records. He signed about every major Christian band you can think of in the early 2000s. I mean, this was the guy you wanted to know as a band in the early 2000s. I mean, crazy list of bands. I mean, Under Oath, As Cities Burns, Anne Berlin. I mean, if you know that scene, you're like, what?
Right.
I'm checking off all your lists right now. He got out of the scene to save his life. It was the Christian music scene, but as he said, it wasn't Christian music industry, it was industry music Christian in that order. And drugs, sex, rock and roll, the whole thing, he had to basically get out to save his faith. And he started this thing called Come and Live, which was a sort of let's get back to being about Jesus as artists. And it rose up, and long story short, we combined Come and Live. We kind of absorbed it into Steiger. He's now a full-time missionary, contributor to the podcast, hilarious guy, radical man of faith. And then Luke Greenwood is in charge of our European he's our European director within Steiger. So the weekly podcast, it's a bit ridiculous at times, as you mentioned.
But that's part of the what makes it cool. I mean, it's just kind of four guys acting goofy, talking with one another, including funny sound effects and all of that. But then you do, you work that all in with talking about serious topics and good stuff. Can you give us the name and how we find
Provoke and Inspire. Probably should have mentioned that at some point. Provoke and Inspire, obviously like every podcast out there, it's on iTunes, Stitcher, everywhere. You just type that in, it'll be the first one that pops up.
Provoke and Inspire. I almost said perspire, but that would be
it's a byproduct of being inspired.
Right. Let me ask you, what your thought is on this, and this I'm going to give you my opinion as a pastor, and I'm going to just ask you for your thought. I think that the majority of churches don't care about young people as much as they say they do. Because if they did, they would be willing to change what they do to be more relevant to younger generations. And they simply will not. Most churches, they would rather do it their way, because for most churches, church is about ministering to the church, to the current people who are there and how they've always done things. So what are your thoughts?
I mean, obviously, without making a sweeping generalization, my perception, I do a lot of speaking, and I speak a lot in the Twin Cities, especially, and I do see a hunger, especially among those who have kids in this demographic. I think then it becomes very frontal, because you're like, when you speak of the global youth, you're talking about my son and his friends who are not following Jesus or who are walking away. I would expand that to say that I don't think people care about people as much as they say they do. I don't think the church cares about people as much as they say they do. I think what I see more than anything is just a loss, like an honest, we don't know what to do. Like I think there's, within every church you have a spectrum, but I do think there's a lot of good people in every church that want to do something. They perceive the growing gap, but they feel like they're just inept. Like they're like, I don't know where to even begin. And I think part of it is I think to distance themselves, they create sort of extreme perceptions of the outside world. Like one thing I fight against all the time in our mission is people say, wow, that's so great that you reach the crazy drug addict, extreme kids. And my response is always, yeah, sure, but we're reaching normal kids. Mm-hmm. They're just outside of these walls. They're not that far away. Yeah, they maybe aren't following God, but I think we kind of like to, I think it's a lot of it is not being aware, is that a lot of people in the church, they think there are, especially in the U.S., there's the church, most people are kind of believing that, and then there's extreme segments of culture out there that sure, they need to be reached, but what could we possibly do? I mean, look at us, we're so distant from them. And I think we isolate ourselves based on a false perception of both the need and God's role that he might have us play in meeting that need.
See, and I don't think there's any excuse not to know.
Sure.
Or not to try to find out, which is why I get back to, I don't think they care enough to know.
Okay.
Because it's not that hard, not that difficult to find out what's going on if you really want to know. One way would be to read your book. That didn't mean that to be a promo into your book, but that's kind of what you're talking about, Jesus in a secular world. But see, I don't know. I just don't see that most people. It's on their list, but it's not high on their list.
But I think I would respond to that by saying that the book, it's very. It might surprise people in the sense that coming from like a younger person and rock and roll, and that it would be very methodologically focused. It would be very about cool approaches and testimonies. And while it has a lot of that in there, it's very old school, and that it's just prayer it's a lot. We often say we're a new school mission with old school values. I always I've been putting this slide up on the board when I've been presenting to people is one of the two endorsements that I got for this book. One was from Chip Ingram,
right,
and one was from Brian Head from Korn, which I think perfectly illustrates who
right,
we are.
Sure.
Not those two people. I don't know if they've ever simultaneously endorsed the book
before.
Right. But that kind of illustrates it for us, is that we are very much about the Bible and about the truth and about not compromising and seeking Him. And the reason why the book focuses so much on personal transformation and revival is I think alluding to my previous point, which is I think people don't care because many of them aren't saved. And I know that sounds very intense, but they don't. Why would you risk, if God is an academic thing for you, if God is a cultural club, it's something you go to, to raise your kids, and you go to your groups, and that's not something you're going to risk anything for. That's not something you're going to sacrifice for. Why would you? It's just, it's not a deep, personal, intimate conviction of who God is, what He's done for you, and then what He wants you to do in the world. I think part of it is we need a revival in our churches. We need people to get a revelation of the holiness of God, of their own sinfulness, and of the reality of the world, which is why so much of the book talks about personal transformation. Our hearts are cold. We don't care, to your point.
Right.
And I think we don't care because you're not going to risk your time, your energy, even maybe your life for something that is academic, not personal.
Ben, often or maybe always at the end of your concerts, you have a 15 or so minute talk with them. I don't know, could we call it a sermon? We probably wouldn't.
Definitely not, and I would purposely avoid that word. It's more like 3 to 5 minutes, but yes.
Okay, so tell me about what you say. Now, how long is your concert?
It's about 55 minutes.
All right, so you've had 55 minutes of great music, of theater. I mean, you put in theatrical things because, as we talked, you and I, before the podcast, the gospel is so much about presenting things visually, which kind of opens up the idea, especially to people who have only heard Jesus in a poor context or know nothing about Jesus. If you can portray this visually now, then you have the opportunity, while their heart's kind of open or they're interested in it, now you can kind of put it together through words. So tell me basically what you say in those 3 to 5 minutes.
A big part of what we do actually I talk about in the book is the kinds of words that we use. I think words carry with them a lot of meaning, and of course we can't become so reductionistic that we don't say anything. But I do think I try when I do the preaching, or when David, my dad, does, we do try to use words that would connect. So they've seen this visual presentation of the gospel, life, death, resurrection of Jesus, very clear but very modern. And then I'll typically say something like, every day you're lied to. You're told that you are just an accident, that you're here for no reason, that you are a highly evolved animal, nothing more. You believe that you're told that the best you can do is to just avoid pain, experience pleasure, accumulate stuff, grow old, and die. And that's what you're told. And I'm here to tell you that that's a lie, that you are not an accident, that your life matters, that God created you, and that if God, many of you think that if God does exist, He is far away, that He's just someone who has a bunch of rules that wants to control your life. But God is not like that. God is a good Father who loves you. And I talk about how many people say they love you, but the love is about taking, and how love, God demonstrated His love by sending His Son Jesus. He wasn't indifferent to our pain like you think. He came. He was with the poor people on the streets. He gave His life. He rose from the dead so that the death sentence in my life can be broken, and that I can be set free and forgiven and healed. And so it's the gospel, but I'm not saying sin. I'm saying bad things you've done, and that seems semantic. But to someone who has no clue about God, you say things like judgment and sin and wrath, and they're going, what?
Right.
They brimstone. They don't get it.
Sure.
So it seems semantic, but I think it's very important in terms of knowing your audience and communicating truth to them.
You have seen some really incredible responses, or things happen when you put it together, what the people have heard in the concert, and then put that together with the truth that you say. What kind of things have you seen?
I mean, we just incredible response. I mean, part of, we'll visually show the gospel, then we'll verbally proclaim the gospel, using, language that the culture we're speaking to can understand. And then we will give people an opportunity to respond. So we'll say, if you feel the power in what we're saying, if you want to, receive this gift and accept Jesus into your heart, we ask people to raise their hands, and then we'll jump off the stage. We'll have these big torches with fire, and we'll say, if you responded, we'd love to talk to you, and we'll have anywhere from 70, 80 to 100 people come around the fire. We'll kind of explain more about the gospel, and we'll lead them through a prayer. And we're always working with the local church. Local churches are the ones that are always organizing our shows. And so we'll connect them. Typically, we'll have a follow-up meeting the next night where we'll call them meet the band parties, and we'll go deeper with the people that responded and connect them with the local church. We have a whole online discipleship platform called istheremore.info. And it's pre-evangelistic and very new baby Christian sort of looks at prayer and the Bible and the community. And there's an informal Bible study you can download, and it's something we're building all the time. But as far as what we've seen in responses, I mean, it's, and then the band will spend over an hour usually talking to people in the crowd that responded. And we bring a camera crew all the time. So we have some videos out there that are pretty incredible. I mean, even from this last tour, you can see them on our Steiger website. Steiger is kind of the main website out. Check out that steiger.org/NLM, No Longer Music. And that's where you'll kind of see the tour report from the last summer. We were just on tour. But just transform lives. I mean, people saying in their own words, I experienced the power. They'll be describing the Holy Spirit, but they won't use the word Holy Spirit. They'll say, I felt this energy, or I felt this love, or this force that and this thing, and it was amazing. I've never experienced this, and they'll often be emotional, and we'll be able to pray with them. And so, I mean, I've just had, I was talking to a girl from Poland on a tour 2 tours ago, and she said, when I came here, I felt like I had this balloon filled with all this shame, and these were her words, all this shame, all this guilt. And as I was watching your show, I felt like this balloon was slowly deflating. And then when you started to explain, it all made sense, and she prayed with me to receive Jesus right there after the concert. And I talked to 2 guys in Albania who said, we're Muslims, we're from a Muslim background, but when you started to share this message, we started to realize that we're dirty and needed to be made clean. I mean, these are Muslim guys with no Christian background, basically explaining the essence of the gospel in their own words. I mean, just literally, I spent the next 2 hours telling you stories of this kind of thing, of God just coming in and by His power, just totally transforming these young lives.
Ben, I'm gonna end with a little bit different question what I told you originally, but if you were a pastor, what ways would you try to make church more relevant to young people? What would you do?
Paul talks about, he says that men are not convinced by human words, but by God's power. And I think that we don't see God's power inside of the church, or quite frankly, outside of it, because one, like we've already talked about, I don't think we take prayer seriously. So I would want to create a culture in my church of reckless prayer, of desperate prayer, of prayer that is not so contained. It's not so who's going to open, who's going to close. It's some intense, schedule disrupting, all night prayer. Put that into the DNA of the church. I think God would move through that, and then I would want to, because I think ultimately people, we can put cool lights and play the latest Hillsong music and contextualize church in that way and create entertainment for people. And I'm not implying necessarily that that's wrong, but I think what people are attracted to is something that actually changes things. right? They don't want to. A lot of the reasons why our kids, I say our, I do have kids, but they're pretty young, why they're leaving the faith is because they don't want a cultural club that doesn't compete with the world they see. They want to know that if they're going to follow God, he actually changes stuff. He's actually powerful. And so I would do my best. And again, it's difficult. I think being a pastor is probably the hardest job in the world, but I would create a risk-taking culture in our church, a church that would put itself, constantly be putting itself in positions where if God doesn't show up, the whole thing's going to fall apart. Constantly getting its people to understand that what they do inside the building is 1% of the mission. That we need to be taking risks and being, if you're never looking foolish, you're not doing it right. If you're never extending yourself beyond your human resources, you're not doing it right. If a church has everything it needs, all of its programs buttoned up, it's not doing it right. Because I think a church should be beyond itself all the time, always overstretched, always a little bit out on a limb, always trying things, taking risks, preaching the gospel. I would love to, if it was me, I would love a church that took prayer seriously and was constantly out there taking risks. And because it's in that, there's that kind of a duality of, God, we're not going to do this without you, but we're going to do this, so be there. And it's this. And then I'm telling you, when you start to experience God's power in the real world, prayer becomes a lot easier. Because one, you're going to start praying when you're about to do something that you're worried about. And two, you start to get it. You read the Bible and you say, "Wow, I actually seen that. This isn't academic for me anymore." And then it becomes like it takes on a cycle. I think people are like, "Man, I need to come back and learn this stuff because I want to be out there experiencing more of what I've already experienced." So that's my very cursory thoughts. But I have incredible respect for pastors. I think it's one of the most difficult jobs there are. So.
That was great, Ben. Thank you for that. I loved it. And I loved our conversation today. And again, if you want to find out more podcasts from me, you can look up 24 Today podcast, or also you can check me out on 24today.org or tomwhitesel.com. But Ben, you can find more about him and his band at nolongermusic.com. Also today, he has released a book called Jesus in a Secular World. And you can get a hold of that book on Amazon, or give us the website, Ben. That
JesusInASecularWorld.com.
Oh, that's right, yeah, JesusInASecularWorld.com. Also, the name of your podcast is?
Provoke and Inspire, not Provoke and Perspire.
That's right, thank you.
Podcast of that name might exist.
But it might help people remember it better. But
yeah, perhaps
that still might give people the wrong impression. Now I'm sounding like your podcast.
Yeah. Well, you're sucking you in. See, that's what happens.
Goofy stuff. Okay. And anyway, do Ben and I a favor, if you will. Click like, subscribe, share. Please comment. All of that helps us to be able to get the message out more. Ben, thanks again for being my guest today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And just a reminder to everyone that there's still time left in this 24-hour period to live life today.
Absolutely.